Hi everyone, I am Rachel Davidovich, a United Nations intern here at Meaningful World. Thank you for joining Meaningful World's annual Mind, Body, Eco, and Spirit Festival at the United Nations. This year our focus is on climate and racial justice, sustainable development goals in action. Eric Manigan will begin our program with an opening meditation. Eric Manigan is a Zen Buddhist who has studied under the tutelage of the Dahajuk Temple, a staunch advocate against religious nationalism and extremely talented furniture craftsman. Please join me in welcoming Eric Manigan.
Powers have much in common are the weapons of unimaginable devastation and death, the technologies that lay waste the world. It's at this point that in our history that when the future all seems to be hanging by the frailest of threads, that the kingdom of Shambhala emerges. Now you can't go there because it's not a place. It exists in the hearts of people and of the women and the men. There are no signifiers and no boundaries and no barricades. There is no home turf. The Shambhala warrior has only the terrain of the barbarian powers to move across, to act upon. Now, the time is coming and great courage is required from the Shambhala warriors, the moral courage and the physical courage. And that is because they're going right into the heart of where the powers are to dismantle their weapons. They're going into the pits and the citadels where the weapons are deployed. They're going in to the corridors of power where the decisions are being made. They're going in to dismantle these weapons in every sense of the word. Now, the Shambhala warrior knows that they can dismantle these weapons because they are mind-made. And if they are mind-made, they can be unmade by the mind. Because of the dangers, they're not from some outside source. They're not extraterrestrial, and they're not an unchangeable preordained fate that we have. They arise out of our relationships, our habits, and our priorities. So now is the time. And in this training, we use two implements, is compassion. And the other one is insight into the radical interdependence of all phenomena. And you need both. You need compassion because that provides the fuel to move out to where you need to be, where you need to go. And that means not being afraid of the suffering of the world. When you are not afraid of the suffering in the world and the pain, then nothing can stop you. You can be and do what you're meant to do. But itself, that implement is very hot and can burn you out. So you need the other. The other tool is insight into the radical interconnectivity at the heart of existence, the web of life, our deep ecology. When you have that, then when you understand that, then you know that it is not a battle between good guys and bad guys. You know that the line between good and evil runs through the landscape of every human heart. And you know that we are so interwoven in the web of life that even the smallest act with clear intentions has repercussions throughout the whole web, beyond even our capacity to see it. But that's kind of cool and maybe even a little abstract. So you need the heat of compassion. So the dance between these two, between this compassion and this wisdom, is our dance. So with that, I recognize that I am not separate from all that is, and I will not lead a harmful life, nor encourage others to do so. Thank you.
Now, Samer will be introducing Dr. Annie.
Hello, everyone. I'm Samer. I'm a UN intern. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ani Kalajian, board certified expert in traumatic stress, fellow of the American Psychological Association, and fellow of New York Academy of Medicine. She's also an adjunct professor of psychology at Teachers College at Columbia University in New York. And most importantly, certainly last but not least, she's president and founder of the Association for Trauma Outreach and Prevention. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Ani here today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Samir, and welcome everyone. This is our 11th annual Mind, Body, Echo Spirit Festival at the United Nations. Sorry, we usually will be at the UN taking pictures in front of the flags and really being part of that, but due to the pandemic, we're going to be on Zoom. I'd like to open up with a poem I wrote around when George Floyd, the tragic situation was happening. And it's entitled, "I Can't Breathe, Please Stop, I'm Choking." I'm sorry, George Floyd. I know I'm sorry, it's just not enough. I'm totally shamed, I'm totally embarrassed and outraged. Stop the cycle of violence, as it's a vicious cycle, begetting more violence. And remember what Dr. King said, only light could transform darkness. My father was an Armenian survivor of Ottoman Turkish genocide, and this trauma was transmitted to me. Remember, trauma that is not transformed will be transferred to the next generations. African Americans have suffered over 400 years and still suffering. Our job is to help heal the pain, empathize, be compassionate, as Eric mentioned, and uplift one another and help them meet their potential, achieve their potential. Racism continues the cycles of suffering and keeps re-traumatizing us and spreading post-traumatic stress disorder and passing it on to 14 generations through our DNA. Therefore, we are creating a trap, a traumatic trap that no one will be able to escape if we don't stop. My parents survived the Ottoman Turkish genocide. They found refuge in Syria only to up and leave again, searching for democracy and freedom of expression, as Turks denied them the right of speaking in Armenian under their oppressive regime. The Turks even cut the tongues if caught speaking in Armenian in public. While you may say that was 106 years ago, but isn't it time to change, as it's still happening today? The United Nations Declaration of Human Rights clearly indicates the right for all races, creed, and color. Don't be complacent. Write letters to your police chiefs, to your elected officials, and demand justice and protection. Demand emotional intelligence education and compassion education in school systems. As Maya Angelou said it so well, history, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived. But if faced with courage, need not be lived again. We don't need to go through it again, so why don't we listen? Dear white people, remember what African Americans done to our country. Think about it. They built our country with their sweat and blood. We enslaved them for over 400 years. Many Blacks have died for America's development without a choice. They sacrificed their lives for our development. We benefit from this empathizing with one another, validating the suffering of not just Black, but all people around the world, uplifting broken spirits so we could call ourselves human again, standing up with courage, transforming our common pain, building a peaceful future together, one heart at a time. Please stop the destruction. I can't breathe. Now it's my pleasure and honor to introduce Pastor Darren Jaime. He's an anchor at BronxNet Television and Radio. He's spokesperson. He's an activist. He's really change in action. We just had a wonderful event last year together, both at Meaningful World and BronxNet, and even yesterday. We're always tackling these issues about transforming trauma and racism and educating. And I'm grateful for our collaboration. Let's put our hands together and welcome Pastor Darren Jaime.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am Pastor Darren Jaime. Darren, I'm grateful for just being here and being able to share with Dr. Ani and Meaningful World. I think that they do a great and tremendous work. I spend a lot of time working with Dr. Ani and the group, really just dealing from a journalistic perspective, trying to spread the word about racism and trauma, injustice, and the things that many people are facing, and trying to really give a perspective to people who sometimes don't feel as though these things exist. And so I'm thankful to Dr. Ani for allowing me, I should say, to be able to share us at BronxNet, to be able to be an instrument and a voice for her, for ATOP, Meaningful World, and for the family to really be able to have constructive dialogue and really to be able to share with others insight into what is a growing problem in America and the world today. I think that many of us right now find ourselves where we are breathing better, literally. I think we could all say we're breathing a little bit better because of this pandemic. And we're breathing better because for most of us, we're in a better place, and we're in a better place because of the pandemic. And so we feel a little bit better, and it's good. I'm glad that we all do feel a little bit better. But the reality is while we are starting to feel better, for many people across America and across the world, things still feel the same. And when I say things still feel the same, we may feel better in terms of health-wise in the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic, but emotionally and racially and the trauma that we're dealing with still remains the same. And so I know that for a lot of us, we spent a lot of time watching television. And most recently, I think that all of us really got an opportunity to watch what happened with George Floyd because of the pandemic. And when we watched what happened to George Floyd was the last of a few. You had Ahmaud Arbery, you had Breonna Taylor, and then you had George Floyd, which was so graphic in front of everybody's eyes that we all saw for now what we thought to be 8 minutes and 45 seconds. And now we find out to be that it's 9 minutes and 26 seconds plus of something that really should have never happened, a murder and the mistreatment of somebody. And you have to think about it for a minute, because what was it that really created this change across America to the place now where Derek Chauvin was convicted? What happened was we saw protests, we saw people going to jail, we saw people yelling and screaming and things of that nature. You saw basically trauma on display. And when you think about trauma on display, I want us to think about it from this perspective. When people were taking to the streets, they were taking to the streets unmasked. They were taking on police officers. They were traveling from state to state. Some people were traveling to Minneapolis to support a movement to yell, quote unquote, Black Lives Matter, and to stand shoulder to somebody in the middle of a coronavirus pandemic. That lets you know the level of trauma that people were feeling, particularly in the African-American community. When you think about this trauma, play it out a little bit further. Here we are in the middle of a pandemic, and people are coming with no masks. People are coming and standing, some do have masks, but they're willing to risk their life literally in the middle of a pandemic to say, we have to do something about racial trauma and the drama that's going on. It was huge. To think about it, it was even more than that. Because when you study the statistics of the pandemic, what we find out is COVID-19 affected communities of color in a more exacerbated way than any other race. So people are literally putting their lives on the line in these protests, in these dramatic moves to say racial trauma can't exist. It can't happen. And so here we are. And we took an opportunity to see what happened with Derek Chauvin in that trial. And I said something to a group of people, and I'll share it with you. I said, you know, as the Derek Chauvin verdict reverberates across America and it resonates in the hearts and minds of many, that guilty conviction, we still cannot be mistaken that the work still continues and the job is far from over. The verdict was nothing more than the first step in dismantling a long-standing afflictive system of destructive practices of brutality, bias, classism, racism, and systematic racism, which currently plagues our society today. A knee on the neck is not the only way that we choke the life out of somebody. I'll say it again. A knee on the neck is not the only way that we choke the life out of somebody. Poverty, food insecurity, racism, bias, prejudice, these are the way that everyday people choke the life out of those in this form of racism and racial trauma and racial bias. Sometimes when you look at certain communities and you wonder why people don't say anything, or why is this happening, or why are people not so active about racial trauma, particularly in communities of color. Let me offer you a perspective. Sometimes in communities of color, people are numb. They're numb to the fact of so much trauma, so much drama, and it becomes PTSD on display every day, that people are dealing with things that other people have no clue about. It was only because of George Floyd and everybody was home that we were able to see Floyd, Arbery, and Taylor. That's because everybody was home and saying, wow, this is happening. But when we were all working and we were all doing what we were supposed to be doing and we were going about our day's journey, people were like, oh, that doesn't really happen. But it was because we were all sat down and had to be forced to watch, listen, and hear the pain of people that we understand that there's some real racial trauma and the need for racial reconciliation to come across America and across the United States. And Dr. Ani is right. If you don't deal with the trauma transfers. If you don't deal with the drama transfers. And so now what we have is racism transferred, bias transferred, bigotry transferred. And what we need today is healing transferred. We need to make sure that racial reconciliation and healing is transferred to the place that everybody can be equal and that injustice will be trumped by justice. How do we do that? Just a couple of things, and I'll let Dr. Andy take it away from here. Number one, we need to understand we can no longer afford to devalue anyone. Here in America, we're still dealing with the fact that the United States Constitution and constitutional law says that African Americans are still 3/5 of a person. That's what it says in the Constitution. And consequently, you got people who still devalue one another's life. And so we devalue people by racism, we devalue people by classism. And the way that we let the healing begin is when we start to put value on people. Black Lives Matter does not mean that Black people are saying that they're better than. They're saying they just want to be equal to everyone else in society. It's not saying that Blacks are better. It's not asking for more. It's asking for equal treatment and equality, and not just equality, but also equity. And so we have to learn how to value people. And then we also have to be not just peacekeepers. Some of us have to really go the way to become peacemakers. And there's a difference between being a peacemaker and a peacekeeper. A peacemaker is a person that initiates peace. A peacekeeper is a one who enforces the peace. We need people who are willing to make peace and make peace and reconciliation a part of their everyday journey. Every one of us has the opportunity to do that as well. How do we become a peacemaker? And how do we become a peacekeeper? Well, there's a couple of things, and then Dr. Ani, you go ahead. Number one, we have to learn to become trauma holders. There is so much trauma, racially, emotionally, psychologically, physically, mentally, that's out there. We need people who are willing to hold the trauma of others and not say that they're wrong, not to point blame, but to just hold the trauma and acknowledge it and say that it's real. We need people who are going to acknowledge that we're seeing something out there. We're seeing people be shot. We're seeing injustice. We're seeing a dismantling of voting rights and civil rights and human rights. We need to say that. We need to become trauma holders in our society. And then in addition to being trauma holders, we have to become compassionate witnesses. In other words, somebody who carries the spirit of compassion wherever they go. We've seen compassion. We now have to share compassion. We have to be that, here's the pastor hat, that good Samaritan. There's so many other people who pass by that one guy who was on the side of the road. And the person who really did the most justice was the one who stopped by. Before that good Samaritan, the man had been stepped over, the man had been passed over, the man had been looked over. But it took a person who said they were going to be a compassionate witness to be able to make the difference. And lastly, I'll say this. In order for us to be a compassionate witness, and in order for us to be trauma holders, we have to be empathetic listeners. We have to listen with empathy. We have to train ourselves that silence is okay. To be able to hear the trauma, to be able to hear the drama, is that's the way we're going to be able to heal the drama. And when we listen, silence cannot be me being quiet, just waiting to speak. But silence has to be me being silent, taking it in, living with it, absorbing it, thinking about it, and living it out from somebody else's perspective before we offer another perspective that's going to be a change in somebody's life. And so this afternoon, I'm thankful for the opportunity to be able to share with each and every one of you. I'm thankful to be able to be a voice for racial trauma and justice and be on the wall. In my pastor hat prior to, up until July, I actually served in two churches. One was my predominant church and the other was the other church, a smaller church in Auburn, New York. And that church in Auburn, New York is the church of Harriet Tubman, the actual church of Harriet Tubman, the church that Harriet Tubman built, where her family and her descendants still live. And what I remember, one thing about Harriet that I'll share with you as we leave, is that Harriet said, when things get rough, we have to learn how to keep it going. She didn't speak good English. She said, keep it going. When things get tough, we have to learn how to keep it going. And when racism and trauma and bigotry exist, we have to learn how to keep it going. Thank you for your time. I certainly appreciate being with you this afternoon.
You can all unmute yourself so we can hear your applause and heartfelt gratitude to Pastor Jaime.
Thank you.
You resonate everything in our 4 modules that we teach in the Meaningful World Ambassador curriculum, and you're going to witness the graduates today later on after our next speaker and the music. And we emphasize exactly what you said, acknowledgement, holding people in their suffering and not denying, rejecting, or criticizing. Why are you still talking about that? And being good Samaritans and empathizing, and also being able to be empathic listeners. And that is how we're going to heal one another, and we're going to be able to transform this vicious cycle. Thank you so much. That resonates exactly with our philosophy and with our work in the past 30 years at Meaningful World.
Now, Diego will be introducing Farah Shandu.
Hey all, I'd like to introduce Farah Shandu, who has been serving as the director at Willow Interfaith Women's Choir for 22 years and adjunct instructor for new student engagement at Queensborough Community College. Please help welcome Farah Shandu.
This is my husband, Reverend Paul, and he is going to be helping me along with the first song, which is just very much dovetails into Pastor Darren's theme. So I really thank you very much for setting the mood for this. It's called We Shall Be Known. We shall be known by the company we keep, by the ones who circle round to tend these fires. We shall be known by the ones who sow and reap the seeds of change alive from deep within the earth. It is time now. It is time now that we thrive. It is time we lead ourselves into the well. It is time now, and what a time to be alive. In this great turning we shall learn to lead in love. In this great turning we shall learn to lead in love. We shall be known by the company we keep, by the ones who circle round to tend these fires. We shall be known by the ones who sow and reap the seeds of change alive from deep within the earth. It is time now. It is time now that we thrive. It is time we lead ourselves into the well. It is time now, and what a time to be alive. In this great turning we shall learn to lead in love. In this great turning we shall learn to lead in love. In this great turning we shall learn to lead in love. In this great turning we shall learn to lead in love. Thank you. The second piece is one that you all know, and I know that you're all muted, but it would be great at the very end if you unmuted and sang the last line with me, and you'll know when I get there. Okay? I see trees of green, red roses too. I watch them bloom for me and for you, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world. I see skies of blue and clouds of white, the bright blessed day and the dark sacred this earth. Join me. What a
What a wonderful world.
may it be.
Thank you. That was absolutely lovely. I'm sure we can all agree. And now, Leona will be introducing Sohaila Eldib.
Sohaila Eldib is a rising junior at Stanford majoring in biology. She is passionate about the intersection of health, climate, and technology. She is the director of global youth-led organization 0 Hour and a board member for the Stanford Climate and Health Group. 0 Hour's mission and platform across the world is focused on the true meaning of climate justice, equity, racial justice, and economic justice. Sohaila aims to advocate for a safe and equitable future by working with climate change organizers around the world. She hopes her involvement within the movement will aid and inspire the path of other youth pursuing activism to better their futures. Please welcome Sohaila.
Thank you so much for having me, first of all. And I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit about what 0 Hour is and what it means to be a social organizer now in the climate movement when there's just so many things at stake. So 0 Hour is a youth-led movement, and it started in around 2017 just as a brain thought of the Science March had like a youth-led and the Women's March had like a youth-led march. There's never been a climate march, so a bunch of teens around the US, 16 and 7-year-olds got together in order to put on this youth climate-led march on Capitol Hill, and that's exactly what we did. From July 18th to 21st, we had a completely youth-led march, lobby day, and most importantly, an art creative day, because we wanted to show how you can intersect creativity and just like personal experiences with the climate movement, as well as like frontline community and voices. With that being said, from there, we kind of had an instance, you know, the phrase when it says rained on your parade. Well, that's exactly what happened at the Youth Climate March. It literally rained on our march, and we didn't get the numbers that we expected, and we were kind of so upset about it. Yet the next day, which was Sunday, because Saturday was the march, we found ourselves on the cover of New York Times, and that was just mind-blowing as a bunch of 16 and 7-year-olds, because we noticed that people were finding this. But now, what makes 0 Hour so unique is the intersectional platform. So 0 Hour has an entirely intersectional platform, and what that means is we're not just focused on the climate movement as it pertains to the livelihood of the planet and animals. That is very, very important, but at the same time, you can't talk about climate without talking about its intersection. What does that mean? For example, racial justice, economic and socioeconomic status, patriarchy, just so many different intersections. When we talk social justice issues, we need to talk about climate, and when we talk about climate, we need to talk about social justice issues, because this is a people's issue. This is a livelihood issue, and people are not just affected by climate. No, they're also affected by the color of their skin. They're also affected by the socioeconomic status in their community. They're also affected by the patriarchy, just so many different things. That's really what brought 0 Hour into light. People were fascinated. They're like, okay, so you're saying that colonialism and racism also are directly intersected with the climate movement? And we're like, yep, that's exactly what we're saying. There's history to prove it. There are communities that are being affected right now that you can go into a neighborhood and see. You can just step into any just like right now, people of color communities and people that are in low socioeconomic communities are already being affected by the climate crisis. And a lot of media points and paints this picture as something that will happen in the future or something that is yet to happen. Yet that is completely wrong, because right now there are communities that are facing higher asthma, higher hospitalization rates, higher just housing damage and housing instability and lack of jobs insecurity because of the climate crisis itself. So that's why we feel it's so important, really, when you talk about climate or when you talk about lively beings, you need to talk about what is already being affected and how intersection plays a role in that. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about the direct intersections. So I'm fortunate to work with a group called Climate and Health at my university. And what we do is work with communities that are already being affected by the climate crisis. For example, most recently, we worked with the Stockton community. And what the Stockton community faces is higher asthma and hospitalization rates because of the air pollutants within their county. And that county is primarily people of color, brown and black people. They live in low-income communities, some migrants, some very low income because of their jobs and instability and insecurity. And they are not only facing the brunt of the climate crisis, but they also don't have any security backing them up when it comes to other social justice, just like issues or factors. So that's really something that we prioritize at Zero Hour. We also really talk about, I really encourage you, I'll put the website in the chat right after this, but encourage you to check out the platform for yourself. We talk a lot about frontline communities. So when we talk frontline, we mean people that are already affected should be leading this movement. A lot of movements in the past have been really co-opted by the majority or the oppressor itself. So as a climate justice organization, we really believe that people who are already facing, let's say, hurricanes or housing instability because of the climate crisis should be the ones who are voicing their concerns because they know that issue best. But yeah, and a lot of other things in our platforms, such as Indigenous Rights Matter, we really believe that Indigenous people might need to be included in a lot of climate justice oriented discussions. Black Lives Matter, just so many different things, and I really encourage you to like look a little deeper into it because this is just a very small scope of a very large issue. But yeah, since then, the climate movement has really taken a spark in the world, to be honest. Just like with the school strikes around the world, or with climate becoming more of a campaign issue in a lot of like the most recent 2020 election, we saw candidates speaking about it continuously and trying to urge people who care about the climate with their sustainability platform. So obviously conversations around these issues are working, but more importantly, we need more blunt and more honest conversations specifically about environmental justice. How does race intersect with climate crisis? How does all the other social justice issues intersect? Because there's no way you can really offer just and sustainable solutions for the future without really taking into account these social justice issues. Because when we think sustainable transportation or when we think housing stability, we need to think about the communities that are already affected and how to first help them, and then second, establish these policies so no one is left behind. But yeah, that's just a little about Zero Hour and a little bit about the youth activist space as a whole. And I really am going to drop the website. Encourage you to look through our platform, encourage you to get involved. I usually end my speeches with, I'm actually the global outreach coordinator, so I work with a lot of chapters around the world. In New York City, we have like one of the biggest chapters who actually had more people turn out at their march than in Washington, D.C., which is our home state. So get involved with the chapter. We really encourage, like we do prioritize ourselves as being youth-led, but we're adult advised. A lot of like where we got was because of Women March like founders and CEOs and things like that who have helped us and advised us on putting this huge movement together. And because of just so many amazing adults in the movement, we got where we are today. So please like help young people and serve alongside them because really this is still a long fight and we're just like starting and like cracking that tipping point into hopefully a larger issue and hopefully a just and sustainable future for all. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for that amazing speech. Now, Carrie, will you introduce Isha?
Yes, it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague Isha, who is also a United Nations intern. She is an undergraduate at Columbia University, and she's also a dedicated Indian classical dancer and uses her work to tell important stories. So now I will be sharing a video of a dance that Isha has for us today.
Hi, thank you everyone. Thank you, Carrie. While she's pulling that up, just a little bit about it. It's a choreography to Maya Angelou's Still I Rise, and it's just a really empowering anthem for women. And I think it's relatable to everyone, and I hope you enjoy it.
In history, with your bitter, twisted lies, you may trod me in the very dirt, but still like dust, I'll rise. Does my sassiness upset you? Why are you beset with gloom? Just because I walk as if I have oil wells pumping in my living room, just like suns and like moons, with the certainty of tides, just like hope springing high. Still I rise. Did you want to see me broken? Bowed head and lowered eyes, shoulders falling down like teardrops, weakened by my soulful cries. Does my sassiness upset you? Don't take it so hard just because I laugh. As if I have gold mines digging in my own backyard. You can shoot me with your words. You can cut me with your lies. You can kill me with your hatefulness. But just like life, I'll rise. Does my sexiness offend you? Oh, does it come as a surprise that I dance? As if I have diamonds at the meat of my thighs. Out of the huts of history's shame I rise. Up from a past rooted in pain I rise. A black ocean leaping and wide, welling and swelling, I bear in the tide. Leaving behind nights of terror and fear, I rise. Into a daybreak miraculously clear, I rise. Bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave. I am the hope and the dream of the slave. And so, naturally, there I go rising.
Thank you.
That was amazing, Isha. Thank you for that. Now, could you introduce Andrew and Leona?
Absolutely. So I'm very pleased to introduce Leona and Andrew. Leona is an undergraduate student at Brown University, pursuing a dual concentration in neuroscience and theater. And Andrew holds a master's in art in human rights from Columbia University and a BA in sociology. And I'm very excited to hear what they have to say to us today.
Hi, so I'm Leona, and today we'll be presenting on racial environmental justice and some of the work being done at ATOP right now in these topics. So I'm going to start, if we want to go ahead, with environmental justice. So just to start, I wanted to talk a little bit about the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. As some of you might know, ATOP, Meaningful World, is UN affiliated, which means that we're committed to investing in these sustainable development goals. And the whole idea with the sustainable development goals is that we're all connected, every single nation, and we all want to create a better future. So if we follow these goals, together we will create a more sustainable and a healthier future for everyone. So specifically at Meaningful World, we really emphasize Goal 13 and Goal 15. We do a lot of work educating people about climate change and also encouraging people to interact with nature in sustainable and healthy ways that are beneficial to both the environment and themselves. So now I'm going to go through some examples of some events we've hosted over the past year and also some practices that we follow. So on March 20th, we held an event in Central Park for the International Day of Happiness. At this event, we handed out these things on the right that are paper seeds. So essentially, the whole goal with these paper seeds is we wanted to encourage people to start their own gardens and to really just invest in their environment, because when you invest in the environment, for one, you claim it as your own, and also just being in nature is very psychologically healing. And so with that, so we do a lot of missions around the world, but I specifically wanted to highlight our Armenia missions because we've established several peace gardens there. And we've also done several ecological beautification projects where we collected trash around universities and just in general really got people to invest in their community and just like it's about loving the place where you are in the best way possible. And currently right now, since we're New York based, we're working on establishing rooftop peace gardens in the area. So hopefully that's something you guys will see in the next year or so. And one final thing I wanted to highlight is the 7-step integrative healing method. Andrew will talk more about the specifics, but this healing method is very core to our practice. And step 6 of this is nurturing Mother Earth. So in this part of the healing method, we really encourage people to share the ways that they engage in nature and also encourage them to develop new ways. And I think it's really beautiful because environmental justice is very core to all of the work we do, and this is proof of that. And again, like Sohaila mentioned earlier, we would be remiss to not mention racial justice when we mention environmental justice, because there are so many different factors that contribute to the environmental justice platform. A quote here I found was, "Everyone deserves a clean, healthy, sustainable, and livable future." When we're thinking about equity, racial justice, and it does not happen without environmental justice, because we really need to think about where people are living and how their skin tone affects the way they respond to things, and thinking about housing and thinking about healthcare and thinking about women's rights. It's all connected, and it's really important to think about things in this intersectional framework. Okay, so now we're gonna move on a little and talk a lot more about racial justice, but again, it's all interconnected.
Yeah, thanks, Leona. So I want to talk a little more about that interconnectivity between racial justice and environmental justice and how that informs our work at Meaningful World. So there's racial inequality, as Sohaila was mentioning earlier, about with both harm and access when it comes to harm from climate change and access to remediation for that harm. So environmental racism is a policy or practice that disproportionately affects a group or community based on race or color. Some examples are that in the US, Black communities hold a disproportionate burden of the nation's waste facilities, as well as environmental hazards. There's also increased harm and lack of aid in predominantly POC communities following environmental disasters, which is something we've seen in some of our own work. These factors can lead to an increased instances of chronic illnesses such as asthma and cancer. So there's always been this connection between this environmental racism and physical ailment, but a lot of what we work on is the psychological ailments that can exist as well. One thing we've worked on in the past is race-based trauma or racial trauma. And this is caused from direct exposure to racist abuse and discrimination. A lot of people may relive trauma on a daily basis through re-exposure. And re-exposure can come in the forms of microaggressions, stereotyping media portrayals, as well as being told that what you're experiencing isn't actually based in racism or institutional racism, but is made up in your head. Some people who have race-based trauma experience nightmares and flashbacks, as well as intense anxiety or depression relating to trauma. They also might have negative thoughts about themselves or other people in the world, as well as increased sensitivity and reactivity. So a lot of the things that we see in more mainstream understandings of PTSD. Racism also causes higher rates of PTSD. So many marginalized groups experience higher rates of post-traumatic stress disorder than white people. Much of this trauma stems from experiences with racism or institutional racism or racist systems. One example is that according to a 2020 survey, Black people in the US are about 5 times as likely as white people to report unfair or discriminatory experiences with police. And this is something that we've seen, especially over the past year and over the past several years in media coverage of many ongoing incidents. One thing that these sort of institutional racist practices and this sort of trauma can create is something we call horizontal violence. So horizontal violence is internalizing aggression of the perpetuator of these oppressive systems. So this sort of oppressive system can create a built-up frustration that would explode horizontally within oppressed people. So lashing out at the very people that love us, the people in our community, the people we're trying to build solidarity with, and being totally unaware of this dynamic is a very common factor in this. And something we also call a crab in a bucket syndrome. So the idea here is that there's crabs in a bucket and one tries to pull itself out, another crab is going to pull its leg down. So they both stay stuck in the bucket. In Meaningful World, we say, don't be a crab in the bucket, pulling one another down. Be a true humanitarian, lift one another up. And the way we try to instill that sentiment and practice is in large part through the biopsychosocial and eco-spiritual 7-step model that Leona alluded to earlier. This is a model that's supposed to help people deal with feelings of trauma, as well as feelings of depression, anxiety, as well as try to teach people about emotional intelligence, empathetic listening, assertiveness, and all these things that are meant to help people kind of break out and transform trauma. So we start with assessing levels of traumatic stress, and then we go on to, in a group, encourage expression of feelings. After people express their feelings, the rest of the group is encouraged to provide empathy and validation. We are particularly interested in teaching people what empathy is as opposed to sympathy. So kind of like what Pastor Jaime was saying, was sitting with that emotion, feeling the other person's feelings, and then responding after that without judgment. We then encourage discovery and expression of meaning. This is based off of Viktor Frankl's logotherapeutic model to find meaning in even the most hurtful and traumatic events in our life. So then we can transform that trauma into post-traumatic growth. Next, we provide information and resources to people. As Leona mentioned, step 6, we encourage people to connect with Mother Earth and share how they've been doing so. It has a very important spiritual healing effect on people, especially experiencing trauma. And then we provide breathing and soul surfing exercises, which is energy balance. Some examples of places we worked recently using this model are in Haiti, where we first went after the earthquake and have been working for the past 10 years on multiple missions. We've also traveled to Nigeria and Niger Delta in 2019. One important mission was that we continue to work on is in Puerto Rico, where we first went in 2017 after the Hurricane Maria. There we were helping people work with their trauma from this event and also try to recover as a community in various other ways. Lastly, we also try to do outreach to the community, both in New York and in the United States as a whole. We worked in 48 countries in the world in 26 different states, and we continue to try to educate people even outside of those mission areas. One example is what Dr. Ani was alluding to earlier, was an interview on BronxNet TV that was focused on transforming trauma from COVID-19 as well as racial violence when these two pandemics were kind of emerging at the same time. We've provided tips on nurturing nature throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as self-care during the COVID-19 crisis. That's all. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Definitely, it wasn't just happenstance that the racism pandemic and the COVID pandemic kind of merge at the same time. Whenever we have a disaster, we have noticed this working in 48 countries and 26 states, is that the disaster, it could be natural or viral or bacterial or whatever, it will just take away all the curtains, covers, and ways that we hid things before. And it makes the whole thing blow up. And then all the problems starts being revealing to us, the other problems that have been hidden under such obstacles or maybe denials, etc. So the disaster, although it is a traumatic event, it does have a good purpose of really washing away some of the ills and diseases of our humanity. So thank you for that. That was wonderful presentation.